going to talk about is a little bit of the insecticide use. Tom went over some of the difficulties we have in sampling bulk grain and why IPM in stored grain is different from IPM in a field crop. And one of the things I'd like to start with is pre-binning sprays. What are some of the products you can use to clean out your bin? And again, I'm going to use our standard line that just because I'm showing a product does not mean it's recommended or endorsed by the USDA or by Kansas State University for that matter. These are just options you have. One of the more common pre-binning sprays is called Tempo SC Ultra. It is labeled for use as a pre-binning spray regardless of what commodity you're storing. Many of you are probably already familiar with this because you use this in your management program. Another new product is called Sentinel. This is a product labeled by Central Life Sciences that was labeled a couple of years ago for direct application to stored grains. You can also use it as a pre-binning spray. That's the product that's on my right on my screen in the white bottle. The other product is called Suspend. It is also the pesticide deltamethrin. It's the exact same formulation in both containers, just marketed by different companies. And then they will both have directions on the label for how to use the material. And at this point, I want to emphasize that the label is a legal document, and anything you spray into your bin or onto your grain has to conform to the label. If you have any questions, contact the manufacturer or your county agent. Another pre-binning spray is the insect growth regulator methoprene. The trade name is Diacon 2. Insect growth regulators do not kill adults, and I want to emphasize they do not kill adults. They affect molting and development of immature insects. This product is also marketed by Central Life Sciences. It's been labeled for a number of years. It's receiving quite a bit of use on wheat in the Pacific Northwest. It's labeled as a pre-bin spray and also for direct application to grains, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So if we're looking for the factors that affect control when using a pre-binning spray, the obvious one is temperature. Generally, these products are more effective at higher temperatures because the insects are more mobile. There's also differences whether you have a metal surface or a concrete surface. We have a lot of bins in the Midwest with metal perforated bottoms. Large elevators generally have concrete bottoms. Insecticides are generally more persistent on metal than they are on concrete. Insecticides degrade over time. Products like Sentinel and Tempo and also Diacon 2 are quite persistent. One of the big issues that affects insect control, and Tom alluded to this in one of his slides, is the presence of a food source either while an insect is exposed or after it is exposed leads to increased survival. Any kind of extraneous material enables insects to either feed on that material, gain nutrition to counter the effects of the insecticides, get water, and also perhaps even physically remove the insecticide particles from their bodies. And we've done a number of tests where we use these little concrete exposure interval arenas to test insecticides. And this is what one of the things I want to mention is, okay, the insecticides vary in their label rate. This is Sentinel, and I don't have a pointer, but the labeled rate is actually 0.25 to 1.5 ounces per gallon. And the dark bar is the lowest labeled rate, and the purplish bar is the highest labeled rate. And you can see at the lower exposure intervals, down around 30 and 60 minutes, you can see this big difference. How long it takes to knock the insects down and become physically incapacitated takes a lot longer at the lower label rate compared to the high label rate. And this is freshly applied insecticide. The tests were done one day later. As these insecticides age on the surface, you're going to get a lot more survival and less knockdown at the lower parts of that label rate. I'd like to right now show an older study with the old formulation of Tempo, the wettable powder. We treated the concrete at the high label rate. We exposed adult red flower beetles for 15 minutes up to 2 hours. We removed the insects, put them in new dishes either with or without flour in the dish, assessed survival after 1 week. And what I want to show in this slide is, well, after 15 minutes, the adults were still active, but they received enough of the insecticide to eventually kill them. But look at the difference when the insects were given food, the purple bar, compared to the black bar. If after 15 minutes with no food, survival was above 80% with food. Without food, we didn't get any survival until week 4, and then up at week 10, we got about 80% survival. Now remember, this was with only a 15-minute exposure. With a 2-hour exposure, we essentially got most of the same effects with the food, but no survival with the longer exposure interval. And that brings up another point. The longer an insect is exposed on the treated surface, the more likely it is to die. So the presence of food material definitely increased the survival of exposed insects. We see similar results when we put beetles on sawdust, cracked or whole wheat. Flower beetles that are knocked down and are immobile recover if put on a food source. And this could be very important when using a pre-binning spray if you're not cleaning out the bins properly. And here's, Tom showed a slide, here's mine, here's old wheat in an empty grain bin. Sanitation and cleaning. Bin cleaning improves insecticide efficacy. Residual piles of grain in bins harbor resident populations that may escape treatment. And we know cleaning is difficult depending on the type of flooring. It's hard to remove a floor and then clean underneath that floor. Tom mentioned a little bit about aeration, and one thing that's important to mention is, as entomologists, we think of aeration as modifying the bulk grain mass. It is not drying grain. You dry grain to get it in condition to store, and then use aeration as part of your pest management program. We've done a number of studies where we put aeration controllers on bins. Fans are activated when temperature falls below specified threshold. And we mentioned 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The development of most of our stored grain beetles is limited below this temperature. We've done studies of manual versus controlled aeration. Manual aeration is just simply going out, putting turning on the fans when you think they should be turned on. And this is a study actually with rice in Texas. We artificially infested some lesser grain borer inside cages with rice, sampled those cages. And so you see, again, the purple bar, this is adult lesser grain borers. Look at the numbers in manual aeration versus controlled aeration when we manage the temperature. Another thing to look at for aeration is pressure versus suction aeration. Do you pull the grain down, air down through the grain mass, or push it up from the top? And we've done several studies to show that pulling the cool air from the top cools off the top portion of the grain mass very quickly, which is in many cases where a lot of the insect populations are. Now, if you don't clean the bin out very well and you have residual piles of grain, certainly infestations can be in the bottom. And to show a study, the bins at the far left are the ones we use for our study. And this is one of the insects, rusty grain beetle. First year we did the study, look at the number of insects in the pressure bins, the black bar, versus the suction bins where we pull the cool air down through the grain mass. Second year, pretty much the same graph, just different time points in the year. Much more rusty grain beetles in bins with the pressure aeration versus the suction aeration. These beetles were in the top portion of the grain mass, the suction aeration cooled off that top portion much quicker than could be accomplished with pressure aeration. And we have a new study in larger bins, 4,000 bushel bins. In the first year we had 3 to 5 times as many insects in the pressure bins compared to the suction bins. Now, is this strictly temperature, or is there an interaction with chemicals produced by the insects? And before I leave this point off, I want to say that Tom just reminded me that you need good roof vents if you're going to use suction aeration. Otherwise, you're going to have problems with high moisture.
Well, and bins run noise, we say. Bins
Yeah. So here is our representative graph for our second year in our big study. Again, here's the total numbers of insects that we found in our probe traps. Look at the numbers in the pressure bins compared to the suction bins. And especially notice the low population in the suction bins during the winter, and then look how quickly they came up in the spring with the bins with pressure aeration. So we're talking about integrated pest management as it relates to stored products. We've talked about pre-binning sprays, we've talked about aeration, and now I want to speak a little bit about grain protectants. These are insecticides used to treat grains loaded into storage. Not all products can be used on all commodities, and this is a good example where you must know the label and you must read that label. And here's a couple of protectants. I mentioned them as pre-binning sprays. Diacon, the insect growth regulating methoprene. Sentinel, the pyrethroid deltamethrin. You can apply these products in combination, which is what we hear many people are doing. Storicide 2, I could not get a picture, that's the word on the left. That is a combination of the insecticide chlorpyrifos methyl. Many of you remember the old trade name Reldan. That was the same insecticide. In Storicide 2, it's 3 parts per million Reldan plus 0.5 parts per million deltamethrin. Actelic is an organophosphate used on corn and sorghum only. It cannot be used as a pre-binning spray for those products because the company never received a label for that usage. So Actelic is strictly limited to corn and sorghum only. Storicide 2 can be used on wheat, barley, oats, sorghum, rice, and rye. And so again, you need to know the difference between the labels for these two products. You cannot use Storicide 2 on corn. You cannot use Actelic on wheat. Organic. Pyganic is a pyrethrum product sold by MGK. We talked about diatomaceous earth. There are multiple formulations of diatomaceous earth that are available for use on stored grains. And why do you want to use protectants in the first place? Well, Tom showed a picture of some of the bins. You may not have the capability to use aeration. If you don't have fans and you don't have sufficient cool temperatures, it's hard to use aeration. In warm weather states, aeration alone may not be sufficient for control. Another reason to use a protectant is that you cannot use a fumigant or do not wish to use a fumigant. And the primary reason you want to use a protectant is to prevent insect damage. And here's just, Tom showed a similar slide. The slide on my far left, you see the wheat and the dust. That's our untreated control, where we put 10 adult lesser grain borer on the wheat and left them for 3 months. This is an untreated control for a Diacon test. Again, it's an untreated control. And you can see what 10 insects do on 100 grams of wheat in 3 months. And this is the low rate of Diacon IGR, 1.25 ppm. And this is the far one is the high rate. You see no dust in those. Now, we mentioned earlier that the lesser grain borer is an internal feeder. The female lays an egg on the exterior of the kernel. the larva has to bore its way inside the grain kernel. Diacon is effective enough that it gets that larva before it can bore into the kernel, so the adult never comes out of that kernel. Fumigants, I'm not going to talk very much about that because Tom's going to cover that. We have phosphine, we have profume. Profume is primarily used for the milling and processing industries, but those are really your two options for fumigation. And just want to say very briefly that fumigants can be lethal if misused. You've got to follow the safety precautions. Profume requires certification from Dow AgroSciences and use of the Fumiguide. Sealing, fumigation, management plan, monitoring, they're all part of a fumigation. And Tom's going to cover that in more detail. There are restrictions on use, where Tom might cover phosphine resistance. Fumigants have been our primary control for years. We are seeing resistance now. There are a lot of sources for fumigation information. You can get that from state universities or from the private companies that are selling the fumigants. But you've got to keep in mind the safety issues. Monitoring insects in grains. Tom talked a little bit about sampling. We can use probe traps. They're limited measurements of the surface zone. They can be a reliable indicator of population development. We've used these for many research studies. We can also use them to evaluate insecticide treatments. And this is an example, and actually a slide I got from Tom several years ago. It's his hand, he proudly points out. This is the inserting the probe trap into the grain. And this is what you never want to see. By this time, you have a problem in grain, and the only thing you can do is fumigate.
On the left. The right is aeration.
Summary, main insect pests may differ with commodity and region in the USA. We're going to talk a lot about cleaning and sanitation and how it's integral to good insect pest management. We've talked about IPM as a component for management, and we've got a lot of options for insecticides now and also for aeration management. And so with this, I appreciate everybody tuning into the webinar. We're all busy, and we just thank you all for taking the time to speak with us and to discuss pest management with us. And with that, I'll take some questions if there are any from the audience.
Okay. So, what is the current and future use of IGRs as protectants?
Okay, the current and future use, I think there might even be potential for more products. As I said, Diacon 2 is an IGR. It's receiving a lot of use. Again, I'm getting some of my information from the registrant, but they do say they're using a lot of it on white wheat in Pacific Northwest, and they're trying to expand the market for rice and wheat in the southern plains and in the southern rice belt.
Okay, another question that came in. A number of our local millers don't want DE at all on the wheat they buy. Is this a reasonable requirement?
I would say for that question, you've got to give the customer what they want. If they don't want DE, then you give them wheat that doesn't contain DE. I think it's up to the customer to decide the specifications. So I think it is reasonable.
Next one is a yes.
So the next question that came in, is it true that DE can lower test weights?
Yes, it can, especially with some of the older products. We've also conducted studies where we tried to look at bins that were, say, top dressed with DE to try to alleviate some of these issues. And we find that sometimes lesser grain borer can go through that top layer of DE, lay eggs, and then die. So the grain below, you might kill the insect, but the grain below the DE treated layer might still get infested.
Okay, I believe the next one's a comment. Dicon 2 is the old name, Dicon IGR is the same, but is the new trade name.
That was
So,
Yes, Dicon IGR is the new name, and there was a label change with that too. The old Dicon 2 had label rates of 1, 2.5, and 5 ppm. The new Diacon IGR has rates of 1.25 and 2.5 ppm only. There are just 2 label rates.
So the newer one is Diacon IGR, the old one is 2.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Did I say, if I said it backwards, Diacon IGR is the new name.
Okay.
Okay, a comment that came in, fans warm the air, so there will be a temperature difference between suction and pressure aeration.
Yes. And that is a question offered by an agricultural engineer. And I work with Mark Cass at our lab, an agricultural engineer, and this is one area where entomologists and engineers need to cooperate. Yes, fans do warm the air, and there will be a temperature difference. When we've actually got several research studies where we're trying to figure out what that temperature actually means in terms of insect pest management.
Okay. Is the suction you are talking about, is it pulling the air out of the silo through the top and bringing the air through the bottom?
The suction aeration is bringing the air through the vents into the headspace of the bin and pulling it down through the grain mass and exiting out the bottom. The pressure aeration is the standard method where air is pulled in from the bottom and the cooling front moves upward into the grain mass.
The fans are at the bottom in both cases.
Okay, and we have kind of a general question here. Can anyone make any useful comments of the current review of phosphine?
When the term review is used, this is Tom Phillips, I'm guessing you're asking about government regulation by EPA. So the label for phosphine has started the review process for the relabeling. I can't tell you the direct stuff. I mean, we are called upon for information and so forth. It's still at the beginning of the review process. The, quote, really bad stuff hasn't started yet, but get ready. Yeah.
And 15 years ago, Tom and I were a part of a committee that was put together the dialogue with EPA when the first review of phosphine came out in the late 90s. We are hearing rumors that they want to revisit the concept of buffer zones. Again, that's just a rumor, but be watching for what develops.